It's 9:15 in the morning on October 21st, 1966, and the children of Aberfan are late. Not because they were misbehaving, not because they didn't want to go to school. They were late because the half-term holiday started that afternoon, and every child in this small Welsh mining village had spent the morning dragging their feet, savoring the last few hours before freedom. Packed lunches sat on desks. Teachers called roll. Somewhere down the hall, a class was rehearsing a song they were supposed to perform that day. Pantglas Junior School was full. 144 children between the ages of 7 and 10, sitting in rows, opening their reading books, whispering to their neighbors. Outside, a thick morning fog clung to the valley. You couldn't see the mountain from the classroom windows. You couldn't see what was sitting on top of it. By 9:17, 116 of those children would be dead. To understand what happened in Aberfan, you first need to understand what kind of place it was. Picture a narrow valley carved into the mountains of South Wales, a single road running through it. Row after row of stone-terraced houses climbing the hillsides, a community built entirely around one thing: coal. The men of Aberfan went underground every morning and came back up black with dust every evening. They had done it for generations. The mountain above the village wasn't just a mountain. It was their mountain. Their labor had built it. Not in the way you might think. For decades, the National Coal Board had been dumping the waste from the mines onto the slopes above the village. Millions of tons of loose rock, shale, and mining debris piled into enormous mounds called tips. By 1966, tip number 7 loomed over Aberfan like a black pyramid, 500 feet tall, sitting directly above a natural spring, directly above Pantglas Junior School. Engineers had raised concerns. Local councillors had written letters. Parents had looked up at that mountain and felt something they couldn't quite name. Nobody in authority listened. On the morning of October 21st, after days of heavy rain, tip number 7 began to move. The National Coal Board didn't think of itself as a villain. It thought of itself as an industry. After World War II, Britain had nationalized its coal mines. The government owned them now. Every shaft, every conveyor belt, every mountain of waste sitting above every mining village in Wales. The Coal Board employed hundreds of thousands of men. It powered the nation's factories, heated the nation's homes. It was, in the minds of the men who ran it, essential, untouchable. Too important to be questioned by local councils or worried parents or engineers who were, frankly, being dramatic. The tips above Aberfan had been growing since the 1920s. Each tip was numbered. By 1966, there were 7 of them stacked along the mountainside above the village. Tip number 7 was the largest and the most recent. It had been built on a slope that local geologists had flagged as unstable. More critically, and the Coal Board's own surveyors knew this, it had been built directly over a series of natural underground springs. Water and loose mining waste are a catastrophic combination. The springs fed moisture upward into the base of the tip, slowly saturating millions of tons of rock and shale from underneath. After heavy rain, that saturation accelerated. The tip didn't sit on solid ground. It sat on a sponge. This was not a secret. In 1963, a local councillor named David James wrote to the Coal Board expressing concern about the tips above Aberfan. The reply was dismissive. In 1964, residents raised the issue again. The Coal Board sent an inspector. His report noted no immediate danger. In October 1965, exactly 1 year before the disaster, a local headmistress named Anne Jennings wrote directly to the Merthyr Tydfil Borough Council. warning that the tips above the school were dangerous. She asked that something be done. Her letter was passed along, then passed along again, then filed. The men at the top of the National Coal Board had never visited Aberfan. The village was small, remote, and working class. The tips were producing efficiently. The complaints were coming from people who didn't understand engineering. That was the attitude. Not malice, precisely, but something in many ways worse. Indifference dressed up as expertise. Bureaucratic arrogance that made the distance between a London office and a Welsh valley feel like the distance between two different worlds. Meanwhile, the autumn of 1966 was wet. Unusually wet. Rain fell on the mountains of South Wales for days without stopping. The underground springs below tip number 7 swelled. The base of the tip grew heavier, softer, less stable. Sensors and monitoring equipment that might have detected the change didn't exist. Nobody had installed them. Nobody had been asked to. On the night of October 20th, workers at the tip noticed something. The surface of tip number 7 had developed a depression, a visible sinking in the top of the mound. They reported it. A supervisor was informed. The plan was to investigate in the morning. The morning came at 9:15. By then, it was already too late. At 9:13 in the morning, tip number 7 began to slide. There was no explosion, no crack of thunder, no warning sound that anyone in the village below would have recognized as danger. The tip simply lost its footing. 2 million tons of waterlogged mining waste releasing from the mountainside all at once, the way a saturated sponge finally gives when you press it one time too many. Workers near the top of the tip saw it first. One later described it as watching the ground breathe. A slow, impossible heave, then a sudden lurch forward. They ran. They shouted. Sound travels slowly in fog. The slide picked up speed as it descended. What had been solid waste became a moving river of black slurry, thick, dense, unstoppable. Flowing downhill at speeds approaching 20 miles per hour, it swallowed everything in its path. A farmhouse on the hillside vanished in seconds. A canal at the base of the slope disappeared beneath the wave. The slurry didn't crash the way water crashes. It pressed. It smothered. It filled every space it entered with the quiet, suffocating weight of a mountain. It reached Pantglas Junior School at 9:15 a.m. The children had just returned to their classrooms after morning assembly. Teachers were calling roll. Some children were still hanging up their coats. The school day had been underway for less than 4 minutes. The slurry hit the building at the back first, shattering the rear wall and pushing through the structure with a force that survivors described as a sound like thunder that didn't stop. The roof came down. The walls buckled inward. Classrooms that had held 30 children moments before were compressed to a few feet of dark, airless space filled with rubble, coal waste, and splintered wood. Some children never knew what happened. The collapse was instantaneous in the areas hit hardest, the back classrooms closest to the mountain. Others, in rooms at the front of the building, survived the initial impact, trapped but alive, calling out in the darkness. Outside in the village, parents heard the sound and came running. What they found stopped them at the edge of comprehension. Where the school had stood, there was now a black hillside. The building hadn't collapsed. It had been buried. Only fragments of the upper walls were visible above the slurry. A corner of the roof, a window frame, a door hanging open to nothing. The first people to dig were not rescue workers. They were fathers. Men who had just come off the night shift at the mine. Men still in their work clothes, still carrying their tools. They went at the rubble with their bare hands when their tools weren't enough. Mothers stood at the edges, silent or screaming, held back by other women who knew that letting them see too much, too soon, would break something that couldn't be unbroken. Children were pulled from the rubble alive, at first, with some frequency, a hand emerging, a voice answering when someone called, then less frequently, then rarely, then almost not at all. The fog lifted by mid-morning, and for the first time, the full scale of what had happened became visible from above. Tip number 7 had not simply slid onto the school. The slurry had traveled through the school, across a road, through a row of houses on the other side, and come to rest 200 yards from where it had started. 20 houses were destroyed alongside the school. Families who had been eating breakfast were gone. 144 people died in Aberfan that morning. 116 of them were children. Most of them were between 7 and 10 years old. 5 teachers died alongside their students, at their desks, in the middle of taking attendance. The last child was pulled from the rubble alive at 11 o'clock. After that, for the rest of the day, and for the days that followed, the men kept digging. But what they were recovering now were no longer survivors. An entire generation of one village was gone. Aberfan had approximately 5,000 residents. In a community that small, every family either lost a child or knew someone who did. There were streets where every house was in mourning. There were parents who lost 2 children that morning. 3. The junior school had been so full because the half-term holiday was starting that afternoon. Children who might otherwise have been absent had made sure to come in. They had come to school on the last day before the holiday, and the mountain had been waiting. The world came to Aberfan. Within hours of the disaster, television cameras were broadcasting images of the black hillside where a school used to stand. Donations poured in from across Britain and around the world. £160,000 arrived in the first week alone. By the time the fund closed, the Aberfan Disaster Fund held over £1.5 million. Money sent by ordinary people who had watched the news and felt something they needed to act on. The inquiry came too. Lord Justice Edmund Davies led an exhaustive investigation into what had happened and why. His report, published in 1967, was unambiguous. The National Coal Board was responsible. The tips had been negligently managed. The warnings had been received and ignored. The disaster was, in the report's own words, a tale of bungling ineptitude. The men who ran the coal board appeared before the inquiry. They expressed regret. They said they hadn't known. They said the science wasn't clear. They said mistakes had been made. Not one of them was prosecuted. Not one was dismissed. The chairman of the National Coal Board, Lord Robbins, initially claimed he had been unaware of the springs beneath the tip, a claim the inquiry found to be false. He kept his position. He remained in his role for another 5 years. No one went to prison. No one paid a personal penalty of any kind. But the cruelest blow came later, and it didn't come from the coal board. It came from the government. The remaining tips above Aberfan still needed to be removed. The community, still raw with grief, demanded it. The cost was estimated at £150,000. The government agreed the tips had to go. Then it announced how the removal would be funded. It took the money from the Aberfan Disaster Fund. £150,000, donated by the public to help the survivors, to support the bereaved families, to rebuild a community, redirected by the government to pay for the removal of the tips that should never have been there in the first place. The families of Aberfan were being asked to pay, with their own grief money, to clean up someone else's negligence. It would take 30 years for that money to be repaid. In 1997, the Welsh office finally returned the £150,000 to the Aberfan fund, with no interest and no formal apology from the government. The National Coal Board was never fined. The men who ignored the warnings, who dismissed the letters, who filed the complaints and forgot them, faced no legal consequence. Their careers continued. Their pensions were paid. Their names do not appear on any memorial in Aberfan. Today, the village is quiet. The school was demolished. In its place stands a garden, immaculate still, filled with the graves of the children who died there. Rows of white arches, each one marking a child who came to school on the last morning before the holiday and never came home. The tips are gone from the hillside. The mountain is green again. But in Aberfan, there are grandparents who never had grandchildren. There are parents who kept the bedroom doors closed for decades. There are people in their 60s now who grew up as the only child on their street, because everyone else was buried in that garden. 144 people. 116 of them children, 0 people held accountable. Aberfan was not an act of God. The rain was, but the tip was built on a spring by men who knew the risk. The warnings were ignored by men who felt untouchable. The disaster fund was raided by a government that prioritized process over people. They called it a tragedy. The people of Aberfan have another word for it: